"Master, how do we change when we feel broken inside?" Peter's voice trembled as he sat near Jesus, the weight of the world pressing heavily on his heart. It was a quiet evening, and the skies were slowly fading into dusk, painted with hues of soft pink and orange. The air was cool, a gentle breeze rustling through the olive branches of the garden where Jesus and his disciples often gathered. They had been traveling for days, teaching, healing, and witnessing miracles, but the weight of their journey was beginning to press upon them. The disciples sat together, their tired faces reflecting the struggles of the road, their hearts heavy with the burdens of their own imperfections. Peter, who had been silent for much of the day, sat apart from the group. His mind swirled with thoughts he couldn't escape, thoughts of his recent failures, his impulsiveness, and the guilt he carried from denying Jesus in his time of need. It was a wound that festered within him, a deep crack in his spirit that he feared would never heal. Peter had always been strong, bold in his actions and speech, but now he felt fragile, as if the weight of his mistakes had shattered him beyond repair. He looked toward Jesus, who was sitting a short distance away, lost in thought. The other disciples sat near him, sharing quiet conversations, but Peter's heart was too heavy for words. He had been wrestling with himself for days, trying to reconcile who he wanted to be with who he had become. The shame gnawed at him, the fear that his failures had made him unworthy of the love and grace Jesus had so freely offered. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, Peter's voice broke through the stillness of the evening. "Master," he said, his voice low and trembling, "how do we change when we feel broken inside? How do we become whole again when it feels like we've shattered into pieces?" The other disciples fell silent, turning their eyes toward Peter. His question, though born from his own pain, echoed in their hearts as well. Each of them carried their own hidden burdens, doubts, fears, regrets, and in Peter's words they recognized their own struggles. Jesus, who had been gazing at the horizon, turned to face Peter. His eyes, filled with compassion and understanding, met Peter's, and for a moment, it seemed as though Jesus could see straight into the depths of his heart. The weight of Peter's question hung in the air, and the disciples waited, sensing that the answer would hold a truth they all desperately needed. After a moment, Jesus spoke, his voice soft but steady. "Let me tell you a story." The disciples leaned in, for they knew that when Jesus told a story, it was never just a story, it was a window into the deepest truths of life and the heart of God. "There was once a woman," Jesus began, "who owned a beautiful vase. It had been passed down through generations in her family, a symbol of their love and legacy. The vase was unlike any other, handcrafted with the utmost care, its surface painted with vibrant colors that seemed to dance in the light. Reds, blues, greens, and gold traced delicate patterns across its surface, and the woman cherished it as the most precious thing she owned." The disciples listened closely, already drawn into the world of the story. Jesus had a way of painting pictures with his words that made the ordinary seem extraordinary, and they knew this story held a deeper meaning for them. One day, Jesus continued, as the woman was cleaning her home, the vase slipped from her hands. She reached for it, but it was too late. She could only watch as it fell to the ground and shattered into countless pieces. The sound of its breaking was like the breaking of her own heart. This vase, which had been a part of her family for so long, was now reduced to a pile of shards. Peter's heart ached as he heard this story. He knew all too well the feeling of watching something precious fall apart, feeling powerless to stop it. The disciples too felt the weight of the woman's despair, for they each carried their own brokenness, the places where they felt their lives had fallen apart. The woman knelt down, Jesus said, his voice growing softer, and wept over the broken pieces. She could hardly bear to look at them. The vase that had once been whole and beautiful was now in ruins, and she believed that it could never be restored. In her grief, she began to gather the shards, each one cutting into her hands as she picked them up. Her fingers bled, but she did not care, for all she could see was the loss of something she had loved. The disciples were silent, their hearts heavy with the image of the broken vase and the woman's sorrow. Peter, especially, felt as though the story was speaking directly to his own soul. He thought of the moments he had failed Jesus, the promises he had broken, and the guilt that had cut into his heart like the shards of the vase. He felt unworthy, shattered beyond repair. 4 days, Jesus went on, the woman mourned the loss of the vase. She considered throwing the pieces away, convinced that something so broken could never be made whole again. But every time she went to do so, something inside her stopped her. She could not bring herself to discard the pieces, for she still saw their value. She still believed that the vase, though broken, was not beyond hope. At these words, the disciples shifted, sensing a glimmer of hope in the story. Peter's eyes lifted slightly, his heart stirring with a feeling he hadn't expected. Could it be possible that even something so broken could still hold value? Then one day, Jesus continued, the woman had an idea. She decided that instead of trying to hide the cracks, instead of pretending the vase had never been broken, she would repair it in a way that honored its story. She went to a skilled artisan and asked him to help her mend the vase, not with glue that would make the cracks invisible, but with gold. Together, they carefully filled each crack with molten gold, using the broken places as lines where the gold could flow. The disciples listened, their minds beginning to grasp the deeper meaning of the story. The image of the vase, once broken and now being mended with gold, was powerful. It was not just a story about an object. It was a story about life, about healing, about transformation. Jesus' voice softened, filled with tenderness as he continued. When the woman had finished, the vase was no longer the same as it had been before. It was transformed. The cracks, once signs of its brokenness, were now filled with gold, shimmering in the light. The vase, though no longer perfect in the way it had once been, was more beautiful and more valuable than it had ever been before. Its scars had become part of its beauty, and the story of its breaking and mending was now etched into every line. The disciples sat in silence, the weight of the story sinking into their hearts. They understood now that Jesus wasn't just talking about a vase. He was talking about them, about their own lives, their own brokenness. He was talking about Peter. Jesus turned to Peter, his eyes full of love and understanding. "Peter," he said softly, "we are all like that vase. Each of us carries within ourselves wounds, brokenness, moments when we have fallen and felt as though we've shattered beyond repair. We may look at our lives and think that we are beyond mending, that the cracks and scars we carry make us less worthy, less beautiful. But that is not how God sees us." Peter's eyes filled with tears as he listened, his heart aching with the truth of Jesus' words. He had spent so much time feeling unworthy, broken by his mistakes, afraid that he had lost his place in the heart of his master. But now, Jesus was offering him a new way to see himself. God does not discard us when we are broken, Jesus continued, his voice filled with compassion. He does not see our wounds as something to hide or erase. In fact, it is through our brokenness that his grace enters. It is through the cracks in our hearts that his love flows. Just as the woman filled the cracks of her vase with gold, so does God fill our wounds with his love, turning what was once broken into something more beautiful and more valuable than it was before. Peter could no longer hold back the tears. They streamed down his face, not out of sadness but out of a deep sense of release. The weight of his guilt, his shame, his feelings of unworthiness began to lift, replaced by a feeling of warmth, of grace, of being seen and loved exactly as he was. "But Master," James spoke up, his voice tentative, "how do we let God fill our cracks? How do we begin to heal when we feel so far from him?" Jesus smiled gently, the kind of smile that seemed to hold the answers to all the questions of the world. "It begins with trust," he said. "You must trust that God's love for you is greater than your mistakes, greater than your failures. You must surrender the belief that you are beyond repair. Healing begins the moment you invite God into your brokenness, when you allow him to fill your cracks with his love. It is in the places where you feel most fragile, most unworthy, that his grace will shine the brightest." The disciples sat quietly, letting Jesus' words wash over them. They could feel the truth of what he was saying, but more than that, they could feel the love behind it. Each of them had their own cracks, their own broken places. But now they understood that those places were not where they had failed. They were where God's love could enter. Peter, still weeping, looked at Jesus with a heart that was both heavy and light. He was still broken, but now he saw that his brokenness did not disqualify him from God's love. In fact, it was the very thing that made him a vessel for grace. The cracks in his heart, the wounds he carried, were the places where God's love would flow, turning his brokenness into beauty. Final wisdom. Jesus stood, his eyes filled with deep love for each of his disciples. "Remember this," he said softly, "transformation is not about becoming someone different. It is about becoming more of who God created you to be. Your brokenness does not make you less. It makes you more, because it is through your cracks that his love can shine through the brightest." As Jesus walked away into the night, the disciples sat together, their hearts full of hope and peace. Each of them had been broken in their own way, but now they understood that their brokenness was not their end. It was their beginning. Just as the vase had been transformed, so too would they be. They would be filled with love, their wounds mended with grace, their scars turned into something more beautiful than they had ever imagined. And Peter, sitting there beneath the olive tree, knew that his story was far from over. The cracks in his heart were still there, but now they would be filled with gold, filled with the love of a God who saw him, even in his brokenness, as worthy of being made whole. This is end of the story. Comment amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.